The arrival. I remember the day Susan arrived at our home as clearly as if it were yesterday. The morning sun cast 3 shadows through our crystalline windows, typical for our binary star system, and I was sprawled on the living room floor, still sulking about Alenka's departure. My junior mother had tried to explain that Alenka needed to retire to care for her own family, but at 12 cycles old, I wasn't particularly interested in reasonable explanations. Ari, my senior mother, called from the entrance chamber, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant I needed to make myself presentable immediately. Come meet Susan. I didn't want to meet Susan. I didn't want to meet anyone who wasn't Alenka, but in our household, when senior mother used that tone, you moved. I reluctantly pulled myself up, checked that my fur was somewhat presentable, and padded toward the entrance chamber. The first sight of Susan made my fur stand on end, all of it, from the tip of my tail to the sensitive whiskers around my nose. She was enormous, towering over even my father, who was considered tall by Korak standards. But it wasn't just her height that was unsettling. Everything about her seemed wrong, like someone had tried to describe a Korak to an artist who'd never seen one and then that artist had attempted to sculpt one while blindfolded. Her skin was mostly bare, with only a peculiar patch of dark fur on top of her head. Her limbs were proportioned all wrong, arms too long, legs bent in impossible ways, and most disturbingly, she only had 2 of each. No tail to help her balance, which made me wonder how she managed to stay upright at all. But it was her face that truly captured my attention, and not in a good way. 2 forward-facing eyes, like a predator, set above a barely mobile mouth that seemed incapable of proper expression. This is Susan, my senior mother said, her tone warm despite the alien appearance of our new housekeeper. She comes highly recommended from the Human Integration Program. Susan attempted what I assumed was supposed to be a greeting gesture, but it came across as more threatening than welcoming. She bared her teeth, sharp, white things that gleamed in our home's lighting, and raised one of her oversized hands. "Hello, Miss Ari," she said, her words mangling our beautiful language almost beyond recognition. "Susan, very happy meet you." I pressed my ears flat against my head, a gesture of disapproval that I knew I'd get scolded for later, but I couldn't help it. This creature was going to live in our home? Take care of us? Cook our food? The very thought made my stomach turn. My middle mother must have noticed my distress because she quickly stepped in. "Susan has experience with Korak cuisine," she explained, her tone gentle but firm. "And she's been specifically trained to care for Korak children." That only made it worse. The thought of this alien monster trying to cook our traditional dishes or, worse, attempting to care for my younger sisters, made my fur bristle even more. I glanced at my father, hoping he'd see reason, but he was nodding approvingly as Susan continued to mangle our language while explaining her qualifications. My baby sister, Isanki, chose that moment to peek around the corner. She was barely 5 cycles old, still at the age where everything was either fascinating or terrifying, with very little middle ground. I expected her to scream, surely this strange creature would trigger her numerous fears, but instead, her eyes widened with curiosity. "Are you really from space?" Isanki asked, her voice small but eager. Susan turned toward her, moving with a strange grace that seemed at odds with her awkward form. "Yes, little Miss Isanki. Susan come from Earth, very far away." To my horror, Isanki giggled. "Your words sound funny." Instead of taking offense, Susan made a sound that I would later learn was human laughter. "Yes, Susan speak Korak not good yet. We'll learn better. Maybe little Miss Isanki help teach?" And just like that, my baby sister was completely enchanted. She scampered over to Susan, showing none of the fear she usually displayed toward new things, and began immediately pointing at various objects in the entrance chamber, saying their names clearly and waiting for Susan to repeat them. My middle sister, Kiri, appeared next, drawn by the commotion. She was 9 cycles old and in her Y phase, which meant she immediately launched into a barrage of questions. Why are you so tall? Why don't you have fur? Can you climb trees with only 2 arms? What do humans eat? Do you have a tail under your clothes? Why are your eyes like that? Most adults would have been overwhelmed by Kiri's rapid-fire questioning, but Susan just smiled. At least, I assumed that's what the baring of teeth meant, and began answering each question patiently. Humans grow tall, yes. No fur because humans have different evolution. Susan climbs some trees, but not like Korak. Humans eat many things, some same as Korak, some different. No tail at all. Eyes like this help humans hunt long ago. The mention of hunting made my fur bristle again. Predator. I knew it. But my parents seemed completely unconcerned about having a predatory alien in our home. Even my junior mother, who was usually the most protective, was nodding along as Susan explained human dietary habits to my fascinated sisters. "Ari," my father said quietly, coming to stand beside me. "I know this is a big change, but Susan comes with excellent references. The Human Integration Program has placed many humans in Korak households, and they've all worked out well." I wanted to argue, to point out all the ways this was wrong and dangerous, but I knew that tone in my father's voice. The decision had been made. Susan was staying. "Now," my senior mother said, clapping her hands to get everyone's attention, "Susan needs to get settled in. Ari, please show her to the housekeeper's quarters." I wanted to refuse, but all 3 of my mothers were giving me that look. With as much dignity as I could muster, I flicked my tail and gestured for Susan to follow me. "This way," I said, not bothering to slow my pace to accommodate her awkward bipedal walk. To my surprise, Susan kept up easily, her long legs covering ground efficiently despite their strange construction. She didn't try to make conversation as we walked through the house, which was the only positive thing about the situation as far as I was concerned. The housekeeper's quarters were at the back of the house, a comfortable suite that had been Alenka's domain for as long as I could remember. Seeing this alien creature about to take over the space made my chest hurt. "These are your rooms," I said curtly, stopping at the entrance. "The environmental controls are standard Korak design. I assume you were trained in their use?" "Yes, Miss Ari," Susan replied. "Susan understand controls. Thank you for showing way." I turned to leave, but Susan spoke again. "Miss Ari," she said, her strange accent somehow even more pronounced. "Susan know this hard. Susan not try replace Alenka. Just try help family." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I hurried away, my tail lashing with agitation. How dare she even mention Alenka's name? How dare she act like she understood anything about our family? But as I retreated to my room, I couldn't help but notice that Susan had arranged her few belongings with precise care, each item placed with respect for the space. And when dinner time came, the meal she prepared, while not up to Alenka's standards, was entirely edible and properly seasoned for Korak tastes. It would take me many cycles to admit it, but that first day contained all the signs of what Susan would become to our family. Patient with my sisters, respectful of our ways while maintaining her own identity, and most importantly, genuine in her desire to help. But at 12 cycles old, all I could see was an alien monster who had invaded my home and stolen Alenka's place. If only I'd known then how wrong I was. If only I'd understood that sometimes the most important members of a family are the ones who look nothing like you at all. The storm. The first major test of Susan's place in our household came during the great storm of the falling season. Looking back, it was probably the moment that began to change my opinion of her, though I was far too stubborn to admit it at the time. Our world, unlike Susan's Earth, orbits a binary star system. This creates some interesting meteorological phenomena, particularly during the falling season when the star's gravitational dance pulls our planet into a slightly elliptical orbit. Usually, This just means we get spectacular auroras and some mild atmospheric disturbances. But that cycle, something was different. I remember waking up to the sound of our house's warning system, its gentle chimes indicating that the atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly. My fur was standing on end before I even opened my eyes, a natural Korak response to electrical changes in the air. Through my window, I could see both suns were visible, their combined light creating an ominous red glow through the gathering storm clouds. All family members to the shelter, my father's voice came through the house's communication system. This is not a drill. We had practiced shelter procedures before, of course. Every Korak family did. But this was the first time I'd heard real tension in my father's voice. I grabbed my emergency pack, already prepared and stored under my bed as per regulations, and headed for the corridor. I found Susan there, already moving with purpose. She had shed her usual flowing clothes for something more practical, a tight-fitting outfit that made her alien physiology even more apparent. But what caught my attention was how she was carrying both Kiri and Isanki, one under each arm, their emergency packs strapped to her back along with her own. "Miss Airy," she called out, her mangled Korak somehow even more pronounced under stress. "Please help carry medicines. Susan have hands full." I wanted to snap at her that I knew what to do in emergencies. I'd been drilling for them since I could walk, but the sight of my sisters, calm and secure in her grip despite the growing chaos, made me hold my tongue. Instead, I detoured to the medical storage, gathering the family's prescription medications and emergency supplies. The storm shelter was beneath our house, a reinforced chamber designed to withstand nearly any natural disaster. My parents were already there, setting up the emergency communication equipment and checking the shelter's systems. My senior mother was on a call with the Planetary Weather Service, her ears twitching with concern as she listened to their report. "Category 6, she announced as Susan ducked through the door with my sisters. "They're calling it a binary convergence storm. We haven't had one of those in over 50 cycles." "A Category 6. I felt my tail curl tight against my legs in instinctive fear. We'd never drilled for anything above a Category 4. Even my father looked worried, his whiskers trembling slightly as he helped Susan set my sisters down. "The atmospheric stabilizers?" my middle mother asked, her voice tight with concern. "Already at maximum," my father replied. "But they weren't designed for this level of gravitational flux. We just have to wait it out." The first impact hit before he finished speaking. The whole shelter shuddered, and even through the thick walls, we could hear the screaming of the wind. Isanki started crying, and Kiri wasn't far behind. That's when Susan did something unexpected. She sat down on the floor, her long legs folding in that peculiar way they did, and started singing. The words were in her own language, something about sunshine and darkness and not being afraid, but it was the tone that mattered. Low, soothing, and somehow cutting through the storm's howl. To my surprise, my sisters responded immediately. They huddled closer to Susan, their crying subsiding as they listened to her alien melody. Even I found myself drawn to the sound, though I tried not to show it. "Susan," Isanki hiccuped between verses, "are there storms like this on Earth?" "Yes, little miss," Susan replied, switching smoothly back to her broken Korak. "Earth have many storms. Tornadoes, hurricanes, typhoons. Humans learn live with storms. Learn respect power of nature. Were you scared of them?" Kiri asked, her scientific curiosity temporarily overriding her fear as another tremor shook the shelter. "Yes, sometimes," Susan admitted. "But fear not bad if use wise. Fear teach us prepare, stay safe. Like now, family prepare well, have good shelter, stay together. This makes storm less scary, yes." I wanted to roll my eyes at her simplistic philosophy, but I couldn't deny that her words were having an effect. My sisters were noticeably calmer, and even my parents seemed to appreciate her steady presence. The storm raged for 3 full days. 3 days trapped in the shelter, listening to the world try to tear itself apart above us. Our house's systems held, but we could see through the shelter's monitors that many in our community weren't so fortunate. The gravitational flux had caused unprecedented damage, destroying homes and infrastructure across half the continent. It was during those 3 days that I began to see Susan differently. She never complained about the cramped conditions, despite being too tall to stand upright in the shelter. She kept my sisters entertained with Earth stories and songs, helped my parents monitor the emergency systems, and even managed to make our emergency rations taste almost palatable with some creative preparation. But it was what happened on the second night that really changed things. The shelter's power systems were struggling under the continued strain, and we had to shut down all non-essential functions to conserve energy. This meant no lighting except for emergency indicators, plunging us into near-total darkness. Isanki, predictably, panicked. Her fear of the dark combined with the ongoing storm sent her into hysterics. None of us could calm her down, not my parents, not me, not even Kiri, who usually had a knack for soothing our baby sister. Then Susan did something I'll never forget. She pulled out a small device from her emergency pack, a human technology I'd never seen before, and used it to project tiny points of light onto the shelter's ceiling. On Earth, she said, her voice soft but clear over Isanki's sobs, humans look up at night, see stars, make pictures in sky. We call these constellations. Each constellation have story. Would Miss Isanki like hear stories? Isanki's crying gradually subsided as Susan began pointing out different patterns in her projected stars, weaving tales about heroes and animals and great adventures. She told us about Orion the hunter, who respected the creatures he pursued. About Ursa Major and Minor, the great and little bears who guard the northern sky. About Cassiopeia, the queen who learned humility from the gods. I found myself drawn into the stories despite my best efforts to maintain my distance. The way Susan described Earth's night sky, it sounded almost magical, not so different from how we Koraks viewed our own celestial displays. Why did they make pictures with stars? Kiri asked, her head tilted back to study the projected patterns. Because humans need make sense of big things, Susan replied. Night sky very big, very dark. But find patterns, make stories, suddenly not so scary. Same with storms, very big, very powerful, but understand patterns, prepare well, stay together, not so scary. I noticed she didn't simplify her speech patterns as much when she was telling stories or explaining concepts. It made me wonder if her usual broken Korak was more about being careful and precise than any real limitation in her understanding. When the storm finally passed and we emerged from the shelter, our world had changed. Many of our neighbors' homes were damaged or destroyed. The beautiful crystalline spires that had decorated our city center were shattered. The atmospheric stabilizers would need major repairs before they could function properly again. But our family had survived, largely thanks to good preparation and Susan's steady presence. As we worked to help our community rebuild, I began to notice other things about our alien housekeeper. The way she could lift debris that would have taken 3 Koraks to move. How she worked tirelessly in the hot suns without complaint. The gentle way she handled injured children and distressed adults alike. She was still a monster by Korak standards, too tall, too strong, too alien. But maybe, I was starting to realize, being a monster wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes, when the world is falling apart around you, a monster is exactly what you need in your family. The challenge. The binary convergent storm changed more than just our city's landscape, it changed the way our society viewed humans. In the cycles that followed, more and more Korak families began hiring human housekeepers, particularly those with emergency response training like Susan's. But not everyone was happy about this trend. I was 14 cycles old when the real trouble started. I'd gotten better at tolerating Susan's presence, even if I wasn't quite ready to admit that she'd become an important part of our household. My attitude toward her might have continued its glacially slow improvement if it hadn't been for Revka Talis. Revka was the daughter of a prominent conservative Unity Party politician, and she never let anyone forget it. She was also, unfortunately, in most of my advanced classes at the education center. Until that point, we'd maintained a careful mutual ignorance of each other's existence. But when she overheard me mentioning that we had a human housekeeper, everything changed. "A human?" she said during our midday meal break, her voice pitched to carry across the dining hall. "Oh, Ari, how quaint. I didn't realize your family was participating in the charity program." "Charity program?" I asked, my fur bristling despite my best efforts to remain calm. "Oh, you know," Revka continued, her whiskers twitching in false sympathy. "The one where we give jobs to those poor displaced humans. Since their own world is such a mess and all. Though I have to say, I don't know how your parents sleep at night with one of those creatures in the house. Didn't you hear about what happened in the southern province?" I hadn't, but Revka was more than happy to tell me, and everyone else within earshot, about an incident where a human housekeeper had apparently gone feral and destroyed valuable property. The fact that the story had been thoroughly debunked didn't seem to matter to her or her growing audience. "They're not evolved for civilization like we are," she explained with the smug certainty of someone repeating their parents' opinions. "No proper family structure, no gland development for emotional regulation, and those predator eyes. They're basically walking throwbacks to a more primitive time." I should have defended Susan. I should have pointed out how she'd helped save our family during the storm, how she took better care of my sisters than most Korak caregivers would have, how she worked harder than any 3 people I knew. Instead, I sat there in humiliated silence, my ears flat against my head, as Revka continued her xenophobic monologue. When I got home that day, I was in a foul mood. Susan was in the kitchen, preparing something that smelled suspiciously like her attempt at traditional falling season pastries. She looked up as I stormed past, her alien face showing what I'd learned to recognize as concern. "Miss Ari? Something wrong?" "Nothing," I snapped, then added under my breath, "Nothing you'd understand, anyway." But Susan's hearing was better than I'd given her credit for. "Susan understand more than Miss Ari think. School problems? Other students?" Something in her tone made me turn around. She'd stopped her cooking and was giving me her full attention, those predator eyes, as Revka had so helpfully pointed out, focused entirely on me. "Why are you here?" I demanded suddenly. "Really? Why come to our world at all? Don't you have your own planet?" Susan was quiet for a long moment, wiping her hands on her apron, a Korak-style one that she'd modified to fit her strange proportions. "Yes, Susan, have Earth. But Earth, complicated. Many humans, many problems. Some humans look for new places, new ways to live. Some find Korak world, find welcome here. Most times." "Most times?" I asked, despite myself. "Some Korak not want humans here. Think humans dangerous, primitive. Not wrong about dangerous part, humans can be very dangerous. But primitive?" She made that strange human laughing sound. "Humans build ships that cross between stars. Build cities in space. Make peace with many alien species. Not so primitive. Then why work as a housekeeper?" I demanded. "If humans are so advanced, why come here and clean our houses and cook our food? Why Olenka work as housekeeper?" Susan countered. "Work not make person less. Purpose make person more. Susan's purpose here is help family, learn Korak ways, help Korak learn human ways. Small purpose maybe, but important." I wanted to argue, but at that moment, Isanki came running into the kitchen, her fur in complete disarray and her school clothes stained with what looked like art materials. "Susan! Susan! I made something for you," she exclaimed, waving a piece of artwork. It was a child's drawing of our family, all of us rendered in typical Korak style with our fur and tails, and one very tall, very pink figure towering over us protectively. "Is beautiful," Susan said, carefully taking the drawing with her oversized hands. Susan put on wall in room, yes. Isanki beamed, then noticed me standing there. "Eri. Look what I made. It's our family. See, there's you, and there's Susan protecting us from the storm, and there's—" "That's not our family," I cut her off sharply. "Susan works for us. She's not family." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Isanki's face crumpled, her ears drooping in distress. But it was Susan's reaction that really got to me. She didn't look angry or hurt, she just looked sad, in that strange human way where the emotion seemed to show mostly around her eyes. "Miss Eri right," Susan said gently to Isanki. "Susan work for family. But Miss Isanki also right, Susan protect family. Both can be true." She turned to me then, still holding Isanki's drawing. "Miss Eri have hard day. Many hard words from others about humans, yes? About Susan?" I felt my fur flatten in shame. How had she known? "Is okay," she continued. "Susan understand. Not first time, not last time. But Miss Eri smart girl. Make own choices about what believe. Not let others choose for her." She turned back to her cooking then, humming one of her earth songs as she worked. Isanki, recovered from her momentary distress, climbed onto one of the kitchen stools to watch the baking process, asking a million questions about earth pastries versus Korak ones. I retreated to my room, confused and angry, though I wasn't sure anymore who I was angry at. Revka for her hateful words? Susan for her maddeningly calm response? Myself for not speaking up? The next day at school, Revka started up again, this time with an even larger audience. But something had changed. Maybe it was the memory of Susan's sad eyes, or Isanki's innocent drawing, or just the accumulated weight of all the times Susan had proved herself more than what she appeared to be. Actually, I heard myself saying, cutting through Revka's latest tirade, "Our human saved our entire family during the binary convergence storm. While your family was evacuating to your private shelter in the mountains, she stayed with us for 3 days in our basement shelter, keeping my sisters calm and helping manage our emergency systems. She might look different from us, but she's more civilized than some Koraks I know." The dining hall went silent. Revka's whiskers twitched in shock, no one had ever dared to challenge her before. But I wasn't finished. "And you know what else? She makes better falling season pastries than your family's chef. Even with those primitive hands of hers." It wasn't my most mature moment, but the look on Revka's face was worth it. As the other students began to whisper and giggle, I gathered my things and walked out, my tail held high. When I got home that day, Susan was in the garden, teaching Kiri about earth plants she was trying to grow in our soil. I watched them for a moment, my sister totally absorbed in the lesson, Susan patiently explaining the differences between earth and Korak botanical needs. "Susan," I said, drawing their attention. Would you teach me how to make those pastries? The earth ones you were working on yesterday?" Her face did that thing that I now recognized as a smile, not threatening at all, really, just different. "Of course, Miss Eri." Susan happy teach. As we worked in the kitchen that afternoon, Susan told me stories about Earth's different cultures and their various pastry traditions. She explained how humans had spread across their world, adapting and changing but still maintaining connections to their roots, not unlike what they were doing now among the stars. I realized that day that Susan wasn't just teaching me about baking. She was teaching me something far more important about adaptation, about maintaining one's identity while embracing change, about finding family in unexpected places. And if I started calling her just Susan, instead of the human, after that day, well, that was nobody's business but ours. The crisis. It's strange how quickly the extraordinary can become ordinary. By my 15th cycle, Susan's presence in our home had become so normal that I sometimes forgot to notice her alienness. She was just Susan. The one who made sure we ate properly, who helped with our studies, who somehow always knew when one of us needed extra attention. Even her broken Korak had become endearing rather than irritating, especially since I'd begun to suspect she spoke much better than she let on. But the universe has a way of reminding you of things you've forgotten to notice, and it chose to do so in spectacular fashion during what should have been a routine school exhibition. The Education Center's science exhibition was a major event in our community, drawing families from across the region. Students spent months preparing their projects, and the competition for top honors was fierce. This cycle, I had chosen to focus my project on interspecies communication, inspired partly by my experiences with Susan. I'd even convinced her to help me record examples of human versus Korak vocalizations for comparison. The day of the exhibition started normally enough. My parents were all working, but they'd arranged their schedules to visit later. Susan had come with me early to help set up, carrying my equipment with her usual efficiency. I pretended not to notice the look some of the other parents gave her. I'd grown used to those, and Susan never seemed bothered by them. Miss Airy's project looked very good, Susan said as she helped me arrange my display. Very scientific. Very thorough. I felt my fur puff slightly with pride. I'd worked hard on this, and Susan had been an invaluable help, not just with the recordings but with understanding human perspectives on communication. She'd even taught me some basic words in several Earth languages to demonstrate how humans had developed different sound patterns for the same concepts. The exhibition hall was filling up when the first hint of trouble appeared. A group of official-looking Koraks entered, led by none other than Revka's father, Counselor Tallis. They weren't part of the usual education center staff, and they moved with the sort of purpose that made my fur stand on end. "Susan," I said quietly, "maybe you should." But before I could finish my suggestion that she make herself scarce, the building's emergency systems activated. Not with the usual gentle chimes we'd grown accustomed to since the binary convergence storm, but with a harsh, pulsing tone I'd never heard before. "Attention," a computerized voice announced. "Biological containment breach detected in Science Wing. Emergency protocols engaged. Please remain calm and await further instructions." The reaction was immediate and anything but calm. Parents grabbed their children, students abandoned their projects, and the crowd began pushing toward the exits. But before anyone could reach them, the building's security systems activated, sealing all the doors. "Quarantine protocols in effect," the computer announced. "Please remain in your current location." Panic erupted. I saw children crying, parents demanding answers, and teachers trying unsuccessfully to maintain order. Through it all, Susan stood eerily still, her predator eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity I'd never seen before. "Miss Airy," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "stay close." Something in her tone made me obey without question. As the crowd swirled around us, I noticed Susan was touching her wrist device, standard issue for all registered human residents, but something I'd never seen her use before. "Emergency services overwhelmed," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "Local authorities responding, but containment teams 20 minutes out minimum." "Susan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's happening?" Before she could answer, Counselor Tallis's voice boomed through the hall's communication system. "Remain calm, citizens. We have detected an unauthorized biological agent in the Science Wing. Containment teams are en route. The situation is under control." What followed was perhaps the most intense 2 hours of my life. Susan seemed to transform before my eyes, her usual careful movements replaced by swift, precise action. She organized the students and teachers into groups, using the exhibition tables to create safe zones away from the science wing's increasingly compromised containment field. I found myself running between these groups, translating Susan's instructions into proper Korak and helping calm the younger children. Several other older students joined me, including, surprisingly, Revka herself. Perhaps fear was a great equalizer, or maybe she just recognized that this wasn't the time for social politics. The real test came when the containment field in the science wing failed completely. The mist, which we later learned was an experimental botanical growth accelerant that had mutated in unexpected ways, began seeping into the main exhibition hall. Several young children, panicked by the sight, broke away from their groups and ran toward the sealed exits. Susan moved faster than I'd ever seen her move, somehow managing to intercept each child before they could reach the contaminated areas. Her long arms and legs, which had once seemed so awkward to me, proved perfectly adapted for this task. She could scoop up 2 or 3 children at once, carrying them back to safety while speaking soothing words in her mix of Korak and human languages. But it was what she did next that truly amazed me. When she realized the mist was spreading faster than the authorities could respond, she did something with her wrist device that made her protective clothing expand, creating a sort of sealed suit. Then, to everyone's shock, she walked directly into the science wing. "Susan!" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "What are you doing?" "Containment systems manual override in science wing," she called back, her voice muffled by her suit. "Can reset, stop spread. Human physiology more resistant to botanical agents than Korak. We'll be fine." I watched, my heart in my throat, as she disappeared into the mist. Minutes that felt like hours passed. The mist continued to spread, but slower now, as if meeting resistance. Then, suddenly, the emergency systems changed their tone. "Containment protocols reinstated," the computerized voice announced. "Please remain in current positions for decontamination." When the authorities finally broke through the sealed doors, they found nearly 300 Koraks organized into clear groups, all safely away from the contaminated areas, and one human in a makeshift containment suit, manually holding the science wing's containment field stable from the control room. The investigation later revealed that the incident had been caused by a student's project gone wrong, an attempt to create a better fertilizer that had instead produced a rapidly mutating botanical compound. If it hadn't been for Susan's quick action and human emergency training, the situation could have been much worse. But what I remember most from that day wasn't the crisis itself, but what happened after. As the containment teams were finishing their work, I overheard Counselor Tallis speaking to his daughter. "Perhaps," he said, his whiskers twitching thoughtfully, "we have been too hasty in our judgment of human integration." Revka, still shaken from the experience, just nodded. Then she turned to me and said something I never thought I'd hear from her, "Your Susan, she's quite remarkable." "Yes," I replied, my chest swelling with an emotion I finally wasn't afraid to name, pride. "She is." That evening, as our family sat together in our living room, all of us still processing the day's events, my senior mother made an announcement. "The council has asked Susan to help develop an emergency response training program," she said. "They want to integrate human crisis management techniques with our own protocols." Susan, looking somewhat embarrassed by the attention, just nodded. "If family agree." Susan's first duty to family. "Oh, do it, Susan!" Isenki exclaimed. "You can teach everyone to be brave like you." I caught Susan's eye and saw that same sadness there that I'd seen before. She still didn't consider herself truly part of our family, despite everything. Well, that was about to change. "Susan," I said, using my most formal tone, "as the eldest daughter of this household, I think you should accept the council's offer." Then, switching to the human language she'd been teaching me, I added, "Family takes care of family, right?" The smile she gave me then was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen on her alien face. The transformation. Time has a way of changing perspectives. As I sit here in my 21st cycle, preparing to leave for the interspecies cultural exchange program at Earth's primary diplomatic academy, I can't help but reflect on how much has changed since that first day Susan walked into our lives. The emergency response program she helped develop has become a model for human-Korak cooperation across our world. What started as a simple training initiative evolved into something much more significant, a recognition that our differences could be complementary rather than divisive. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I should tell you about the day everything changed, really changed, in our household. It was about 6 months after the incident at the science exhibition, and Susan had just returned from a training session with the Emergency Response Corps. Miss Airy, she called as she entered the house, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant something important was happening. Family meeting soon. Susan have announcement. I found her in the kitchen, preparing dinner with her usual efficiency but with an unusual tension in her movements. My sisters were already there, Kiri helping with the cooking while Isanki drew another of her endless pictures of our family, which now featured a prominent collection of humans and Koraks working together. Is everything all right? I asked, noting how Susan's normally steady hands seemed slightly unsure. Yes, no, maybe, she replied, abandoning her usual simplified speech patterns. Susan. I need make decision. Important decision. Need family input. Before she could elaborate, my parents arrived home. All three mothers looked tired, they'd been dealing with the political fallout of the new integration policies, but my father seemed oddly energetic, his whiskers twitching with what I recognized as suppressed excitement. Once we were all seated around the dining table, Susan remained standing, her height making her seem more imposing than usual. Emergency Response Corps offers Susan new position, she announced. Full trainer, equal rank with Korak instructors. But. She paused, her alien features showing clear conflict, position require long commitment. 5 cycles minimum. Also require. Another pause, require Susan become citizen. The silence that followed was deafening. Citizenship for humans was a hotly debated topic in our society. While humans had been living and working among us for years, full citizenship was still rare, granted only in exceptional circumstances. They're offering you citizenship? My senior mother asked, her tone carefully neutral. Yes, Susan replied. But Susan not want accept without family permission. Susan work for family first. Always. Permission, my father said, his whiskers twitching more vigorously now. Susan, why would you need our permission? Because, Susan said, and I was startled to hear her voice shake slightly, citizenship means Susan stay here. Permanent. No more Earth visits. No more human colony rotation. Stay here, with. She gestured at all of us, then seemed to catch herself. Stay here, work for family. Work for family? Isanki burst out, jumping up from her chair. But Susan, you are family. Isanki, our middle mother started to scold, but my father held up a hand to stop her. No, he said, she's right. He turned to Susan, his posture formal. Susan, when was the last time you took a rest day? Susan blinked her predator eyes in confusion. Rest day? Yes. According to your contract, you're entitled to 2 rest days per week, plus holiday leave. When did you last take one? Susan, not need rest days. Family need. That's not what I asked, my father interrupted gently. When was the last time you took a day off? Susan seemed to shrink slightly, despite her height. 3 cycles ago? Maybe 4. And why haven't you taken any since then? Family needs Susan. Children need help with studies, house need maintenance, meals need cooking. No, my senior mother cut in, that's not why. Tell us the truth, Susan. Why haven't you taken your rest days? I watched as Susan struggled with herself, her usually confident posture uncertain. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because rest days mean Susan not family. Mean Susan just worker. Susan not want be just worker. My junior mother, who had been quietly observing until now, stood up. Despite being the smallest of my mothers, she had a presence that could fill a room when she chose. Then why are we still pretending, she asked. Why are we maintaining this fiction that you're just our housekeeper? You haven't been just a worker for cycles now, if you ever were. She turned to my other parents. We've discussed this. We've all seen it. She's been acting as a fourth mother to our children in everything but name. She's put her life on the line for our family multiple times. She's given up her rest days, her holidays, her rotation rights, all to stay with us. How much more does she need to do to prove herself? Nothing, my father said firmly. She's done more than enough. He stood as well, addressing Susan directly. We were going to wait until after the citizenship question was settled, but perhaps this is the right time after all. Susan, we would like to formally offer you adoption into our family, not as a worker, but as a full parent, equal in status and responsibility to any of us. I felt my fur stand on end with shock. Adult adoption was rare in Korak society, usually reserved for combining noble houses or preserving important family lines. For my parents to offer it to a human. Susan seemed equally stunned. But Susan not Korak. Not have proper glands, not have right features, not even speak properly. Oh, stop that right now, I found myself saying, standing up as well. We all know you can speak perfectly well when you want to. You just keep up that simplified speech pattern because you think it makes you less threatening to others. Susan's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. The children have already accepted you, my middle mother added. You've proven your worth to the community. The only one still treating you as an outsider is you. But what about council? Susan asked. Law say. The law says nothing about species requirements for family adoption, my father interrupted. We checked. Thoroughly. It's never been done before, but there's no law against it. And after what you did at the science exhibition, I doubt even Counselor Tallis would object. Besides, my senior mother added with a small smile, it would solve the citizenship question rather neatly, wouldn't it? I watched as Susan processed all this, her alien features going through a series of expressions I'd learned to read over the years, shock, confusion, hope, fear, and finally something that looked very much like joy. Susan. She started, then corrected herself. I would be honored. More than honored. But are you sure? This will change things. Make complications for family. Susan, Sankey said, climbing onto a chair so she could be closer to eye level with her, you changed things the day you walked in our door. All good changes. She's right, I added. You taught us that being different isn't the same as being wrong. That strength can look strange at first but prove invaluable when it matters. That family isn't about what you look like or where you come from, but about how much you're willing to give of yourself for those you love. Kiri, who had been unusually quiet until now, spoke up. Did you know that in all the research I've done about human families, I've never found any that have multiple parents like we do? But you adapted to our way of life without ever making us feel like your way was better or worse. You just added your strength to ours. Speaking of research, my father said, we've already looked into the precedents for human adoption into Korak families. There aren't any, of course, but that just means we get to set the precedent. The paperwork is already prepared, has been for some time, actually. We just need your consent. Susan looked around at all of us, her family in everything but law, waiting to make it official, and did something I'd never seen her do before. she cried. Human tears are strange things, clear liquid rolling down their faces, but somehow they seemed perfectly natural in that moment. Yes, she said simply, in perfect Korak. Yes to all of it. The adoption ceremony was held 3 days later, attended by what seemed like half the city. Counselor Tallis himself spoke in favor of it, citing it as a historic moment in Korak human relations. Revka, standing with her father, caught my eye during the ceremony and gave me a small nod of approval. But what I remember most was watching Susan sign her name on the family register, not in the employee section where it had been for so long, but in the parent section, right alongside my other mothers. She signed first in Korak script, then added her human name below it, making her the first entry in our family's history to carry 2 names. As I prepare to leave for Earth now, I can't help but think about how much Susan changed our family, and by extension, our society. She showed us that monsters aren't always what they seem, that differences can be strengths, and that family is something you build with love rather than biology. My room is packed, my travel documents are prepared, and my family, all of my family, is waiting to say goodbye. Susan has been particularly helpful in preparing me for Earth, teaching me human customs and helping me understand what to expect. She says I'll be staying with her sister's family during my studies, another example of how our families have intertwined. Ready, Miss Airy? Susan asks from my doorway, using her old form of address teasingly. Ready, fourth mother, I reply in the same tone, using her formal title. She smiles, that same smile that once seemed so threatening and now just looks like love, and helps me with my bags. As we walk down the corridor together, I realize that this, perhaps, is Susan's greatest legacy, not just the breaking down of barriers between our species, but the building of bridges in their place. In the end, it turns out that sometimes the best kind of monster is the one who shows us that we're not so different after all.